starting question is like, tell us about, about a bit of your earliest background, like where you're born and raised, any good memories from there.
Yeah. Well, I was born in New York City in the United States, and I grew up in New York. So I had a rough childhood, but I also came to academia very circuitously. So I actually dropped out. I stopped going to school when I was 14 years old, and I dropped out of high school here in the United States when I was 16, because that's when you can legally do it. And then I just studied on my own. I eventually got what we call here in the United States a GED, General Equivalency Diploma, which recognizes the equivalent of a high school diploma. And then I left the United States when I was 18 years old.
Mm.
And I actually have a story, a very interesting anecdote that I'll come back to 18 years old in just a minute. But my father had a brother that we never met, because apparently my father and his brother, our uncle, didn't get along. Not only did we never meet him, but we knew actually nothing about him, his side of the family, as I was growing up and all of my life until this past summer. And this past summer, out of nowhere, I got a communication from a long lost cousin I had never met, never knew about growing up. And she reached out to me because of these, Ancestry.com and the new DNA technology, and that's how we discovered each other. But the reason I'm telling this story is that she had done this incredible genealogical research on my father's side, on our shared side, the family. And it turns out that my grandparents migrated from what is today Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania, from that area.
Oh my God.
So I have these incredible new discoveries about, so I'd be second generation born in the United States. So it's really exciting, and we've actually got the names of a lot of our ancestors from that area, and we probably have family members that are suffering right now with what's going on in Ukraine. But anyway, so when I was 18, I left the United States, and I actually went to how I got there and what I was doing there is another story. But I did get to East Africa, spent 2 years there, 1 year in West Africa, and it's really in this 3 year from 18 to 21 years old that was my political formation. I was in touch with, and I became politicized through African revolutionaries, African Marxists who had participated in the anti-colonial struggles. This is the late 1970s, so that generation is still alive. And then they were all participating in the struggles against neocolonialism and the new African elites and the new African bourgeoisie. And some of them spent many years in prison. But anyway, they introduced me to Marxism and to radical theories and radical history. And then right about this time, spending these 3 years in Africa, the Sandinista revolution was breaking out in Nicaragua, and the Central American revolutions were taking off. And so I got as quickly as I could from East to, really West Africa at the time, to Central America. And I spent the next 10 years participating in the Nicaraguan revolution, but also the Central American revolutions. And I was actually a journalist. I was an advisor to the Nicaraguan foreign ministry at the time. Never thought I would end up in academia. I did continue my theoretical work on studying basically Marxism, but nothing else really, and no deep history. So there was the change of government. The Sandinistas lost power. I was invited to leave Nicaragua, and so ended up kind of a refugee back in the United States in my 30s. And it's here where I went to graduate school. Sort of, it was the idea of just take a rest and then get back to Nicaragua, get back to whatever political life I had. But I ended up falling in love with theory and history. I had deep study into history and theory. And so I eventually decided to make a career change and this life change and stay in the United States and become a professor. But I never would have imagined I'd be in academia when I was for the first 35 years maybe of my life. So that's more of a political biography than anything else.
Oh my God. I mean, that's an amazing story. Does it mean, like, did you get involved in any kind of arms struggle as well?
Well, yes. So all of us at the time, we joined the militia. So the militia was not the Sandinista army that did the full-time fighting. but it was a support for the formal Sandinista army, and of course we're trained militarily in case there had been a U.S. invasion. So, I mean, all of us who considered ourselves revolutionary and were part of that revolution got militia training and joined the militia, and so we participated in one or another way in the actual fighting in the against the counter-revolution. This would be in Nicaragua. And of course, the armed struggles were going on in El Salvador and in Guatemala at the time. And no, I did not participate in them directly, but rather through my political work inside the Sandinista Party, participated in in those neighboring struggles.
Because, like, I mean, one of the things I teach, like Middle East politics and especially like Iranian Revolution and especially Iran-Iraq war. And one of the, controversial thing happened during the war is Iran-Contra scandal.
Yes.
Did you have any memories about that?
Absolutely, yeah. And so our histories are linked in several ways here. One way, of course, is the Iranian Revolution takes place in 1979, as does the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Grenadian Revolution, which was snuffed out, of course, with the U.S. invasion of 1983. And so what's going on is this, which I know we'll get into later in the interview, of course, is the crisis of world capitalism of the 1970s. And that creates conditions which really gave us an opening for revolutions in Central America and in Iran, for that matter. And of course, those revolutions take different trajectories and tragic endings. But that's one thing. The other thing that links, right, Iran and Central America is that precisely the U.S. Congress had legally cut off the ability of the U.S. government to continue sending weapons to the Nicaraguan counter-revolutionaries. So we know the story that the U.S. sold these weapons to Iran and then used that money for the counter-revolution. And so there's all of these different links, and it just reminds us that we live not just in a single world capitalist system, in this incredible economic integration, but our political struggles overlap and link up with the larger structural issues of world capitalism in many different ways.
Like one of the funny stories is this character, Oliver North. I mean,
yeah.
and obviously he's like a small fish, but also criminal. And
yes.
then when you were a criminal, you might have gone to jail, and then America has got this brilliant idea. If you're president, you can pardon people, randomly.
Yeah.
And then and in your later life, Oliver North became, I think he's like military analyst for Fox News.
Yes, I mean, if you're a criminal as part of the power structure in the ruling class, your crimes are decriminalized, right? Either legally they're decriminalized, or they're decriminalized for presidential pardons. And of course, if you do the tiniest little petty crime on the streets, which are crimes of survival, of course you're thrown in jail. And of course I wasn't in the U.S. with the Iran-Contra scandal, so I'm looking at the whole thing from Central America. And of course, ideologically, politically, the level of our consciousness is very different than the United States. But inside the United States, at the time, Oliver North was considered this hero, a big heroic figure, even though he's this criminal involved in international crimes, which just goes to show the extent to which the ruling groups, at least at that time, were on the political ideological offensive and had a lot of success in that offensive. And that's part of the story of the crisis today, the crisis of global capitalism, right? I might as well just jump into this for a moment, that, in my analysis, world capitalism has these periodic crises. There's the cyclical crises of every 10 years. Then there's the business cycle, right? Then there's the big structural crises of every 40 to 50 years or so. There's also a systemic crisis. And of course, I'm arguing we are in a systemic crisis. But in terms of the structural crises, so in the 1970s, world capitalism enters this big structural crisis. And it's the ruling groups, what's going on here is the ruling groups had a serious problem with the power of the working and popular classes. That power, the correlation of forces worldwide had been shifting in favor of the working and popular classes worldwide. with the national liberation movements in the third world, with the workers' movements all over, with these Black and Chicano liberation movements in the United States, with the student movement, countercultural movement. There's a big crisis of hegemony. So the ruling classes respond, and then comes the structural crisis, right? Nixon takes the U.S. off the dollar standard in what was it, 72, right? And then there's global stagnation and stagflation. So the ruling groups respond to this really organic crisis of world capitalism in the early 1970s with a counteroffensive. Capitalist globalization, the neoliberal counter-revolution, symbolized in the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan. But there's also political and ideological and cultural dimensions to this counter-revolution, right? To this counter-offensive by the ruling groups. And, part of that is the turn towards postmodernism and post-structuralism, the rejection of Marxism. But I'm saying all of this because part of that offensive was very much ideological. And so by the time in the United States, by the mid-1980s, the ruling classes are now fully on the offensive. And the popular and working classes around the world have been pushed to the defensive. And in that political, ideological environment, Oliver North now becomes a hero, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure whether this would be fair to you, to ask this question about two of the ideologues for those neoliberal, that kind of structure, Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. What's your views about these two people?
Right. Well, of course, they're both. Hayek is the father of neoliberalism and the classical neoclassical economist, right? And then Milton Friedman is his disciple. Not literally, wasn't a student, I don't think, but is his disciple. But what's interesting and important about the two of them, these theoretical and ideological founders of neoliberalism, as we call it today, again, based on neoclassical economics. What's important to mention here is that those ideas had been around for a long time. Remember, Hayek came out against Keynes, John Keynes, right? But those ideas did not serve the ruling classes in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and into the 60s, because even the ideas have to match a material reality and actual social and class interests and political projects. And they didn't match because the ruling classes needed and followed the Keynesian economics because that is what world capitalism required, and that's what resolved the problems of world capitalism emerging from the Great Depression of the 1930s and World War II. It's later on when the Keynesian form of capitalism, what I call nation-state redistributive capitalism, enters into this crisis. It's only later on also, and again, when the working and popular classes are on the offensive worldwide, that the ruling classes engage in this counter-revolution, and now they need the theories and the ideological scaffolding of Hayek and of Milton Friedman. So that's what's very important. We imagine they came out of nowhere in the 1980s to impose neoliberalism, but that's not the case. Their ideas were floating around for decades, and suddenly the ruling group said, now we need and want those ideas and the project behind them, right? So there's always that correspondence between ideas, ideologies, the role of politics in mediation, and the underlying economic, structural matters.
Especially that time, that 70s, 80s, Reagan and Thatcher suddenly became hero of everyone. They're delivering stuff. They're delivering stuff obviously for the ruling class, not for the
right.
for the poor.
Right. And from the viewpoint of the ruling class, Reagan and Thatcher are heroes because they saved capitalism from itself and from mass rebellion from below at a time of acute crisis in world capitalism. That was the last giant crisis, the 1970s. Now, of course, 2008, that symbolic date, with the financial collapse of 2008, now we're in a new structural crisis, which, that's the topic of the book, and global capitalism endure. But sure, there's currently, it's interesting. Reagan and Thatcher symbolized, and that's why they're heroes, this response to that crisis, which was very successful for the emerging transnational capitalist class and for the transnational elite. So capitalism restabilizes through this global project. But now in 2008, we enter into another deep structural crisis. It's turning into a systemic crisis. It's continuing in 2023. COVID didn't create it. It just revealed all those contradictions and made it even worse. But this time around, there's no heroes. There's no Reagans, there's no Thatchers, there's no Hayeks, there's no Friedmans, right? To tell to the ruling class, here's what we got to do. We're going to resolve this. So, I mean, the ruling classes right now are rudderless. They're clueless. They don't know what to do in the face of this crisis.
But at the same time, they've got lots of money, huge amount of money.
Well, they have huge amounts of money, but that doesn't resolve. That only aggravates the underlying structural contradictions of this crisis. I mean, there's these contradictions that can't resolve from the actual money that they have or from their control over the global circuits of accumulation. These are contradictions internal to global capitalism, and their money can't resolve it. For that matter, part of this structural crisis is it's a structural crisis of overaccumulation. They've accumulated so much wealth that they can't possibly reinvest it profitably. They can't even spend it. Right? But again, that what you're referring to, they have lots of money, is really another way of saying that we're seeing unprecedented global social polarization. And from reading the book that 1% of humanity controls 52% of the world's wealth, 20% controls 95% of the world's wealth, and 80% of humanity has just 5% of the world's wealth. So when you point out that the ruling groups have all this money, but it's not going to help them to reproduce the system, because for two different reasons. One is that that 80% cannot consume, right? So you have a crisis of overproduction and underconsumption. Classically, the global market cannot absorb the output of the global economy. So we have this chronic stagnation. And then at a deeper structural level, going together with the overproduction under consumption is overaccumulation of capital, meaning, capital has accumulated in such a way that it can no longer profitably reinvest. And there's been downward pressure for 30 years now on the rate of profit. And really, the rate of profit is lower than it's been in decades and decades. I think 6% is the figure I have in the book. In the 2000 teens is 6%, the rate of profit for productive investment. So all of that accumulated money they have is the magnitude of accumulated capital. It's an indicator, right, of incredible social polarization. But it's not the same as saying that accumulated money can be profitably reinvested. It can't be right now. So I don't know if you want to go into the larger discussion on that, but that's really the whole structural or economic side of this crisis, this all-around multidimensional crisis of global capitalism.
One of the things, I'm a bit of interested about the psychology behind this, why the super rich. You call them transnational capitalist class. Why they're so cruel? What's the end game here?
Yeah,
it kind of looks like some people are planning to go to Mars. I don't know,
They destroy our planet and then use their wealth to leave it and leave the rest of us behind to just die. That's what they're envisioning, specifically Elon Musk, right? His plan to colonize Mars so he and his family can go there and continue to propagate. May Elon Musk rot in hell, but that's neither here nor there. I think the thing is that we have to remember that the capitalist or capital has only one objective, and it's expanded reproduction of capital. That is endless profit making, the endless accumulation of capital. So the transnational capitalist class is neither cruel nor friendly. It's really, all of that is irrelevant. Transnational capitalists simply want to endlessly accumulate. But in order to be able to endlessly accumulate, you have to be cruel. You have to dispossess, right? You have to pay starvation wages and super exploit workers. You have to call on the army and the police to intervene and to repress when there's some threat to accumulation. So the story starts with simply the objective impulse, the imperative of capital itself to accumulate and ceaselessly. And all of that cruelty comes in what they need to do necessarily in order to do that. So there's the transnational capitalist class. And by the way, going back to you saying they're very rich, but the data is absolutely shocking that just 17 global financial conglomerates in 2020 controlled nearly $42 trillion of wealth in the world, which is more than half of the entire GNP of the planet, right? The entire output of the planet. So you're talking about 17 conglomerates has more than half of the whole global economy, in which 7.5 billion people we all depend, we're all integrated in. But so that's the transnational capitalist class, right? And to the extent that these inequalities are simply unprecedented, and to the extent that the transnational capitalist class is implacably expanding and dispossessing at an accelerated rate, they need to rely more and more on coercive mechanisms of social control and repression. So we've been moving towards a global police state, which I've written about. I actually, this book, Can Global Capitalism Endure, is the third in a trilogy. So my first was published, The Global Police State, that came out in 2020. Then Global Civil War came out early in 2022. And then this past summer, Can Global Capitalism Endure? And the irony of the trilogy is the shortest book is Can Global Capitalism Endure, the one we're discussing. But it's probably the most important because it extracts some from those first two and really culminates the whole story. But where I was going with this, so that's the global police state, and in part the global police state is being imposed by the transnational capitalist class, precisely because there's a global revolt underway. That's the theme of the second book, Global Civil War. The masses are on the move. They can't be contained. So that's why we're moving towards global police state, but also dictatorship, systems of authoritarian social control, fascism, etc. But I want to make the final point here that we have two segments of the global ruling classes. One is a transnational capitalist class. Those are the capitalists. And then we have what I call the transnational elite. These are not necessarily capitalists in the sense that they're not CEOs of corporations. They're not necessarily millionaires or billionaires that control the global economy. They can be very often state managers and state officials, or those that run the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, those that organize the World Economic Forum, the Atlantic Council, etc. Right? All of these institutional and state elites who do the political work for the transnational capitalist class, or in conjunction with the transnational capitalist class. And it's here where you really get, they're all criminals. Look, they're all criminals. Dragging humanity down. But it's at the level of these transnational elite, especially the state officials that control states, where you really get the absolute in-your-face criminal behavior and the cruelty. You started the question, saying, why are they so cruel? So it's U.S. officials do the dirty work for transnational capital, right? And they go to, well, you and we all know the whole story of what the U.S. state does around the world. But let me just, so you're talking about cruelty. So, George Floyd, we all saw how he was murdered so brutally right there in the streets in Minneapolis. And, of course, that led to the biggest mass rebellion in the history of the United States. 25 to 30 million young people, largely young people, took to the streets for 2 months, and it terrified the ruling groups. But I'm mentioning that because we want to remember the police are simply the coercive instrument of the capitalist state, right? They're just defending property from the propertyless. That's their role. So behind the police is the cruelty of the capitalist system itself. And we don't want to fall into these ideas that if you just plead to the ruling groups to be less cruel, or to be a little nicer, that will resolve any of these underlying contradictions. The cruelty comes out of the contradictions internal to global capitalism.
And I'm not sure whether this will make any sense, because I teach Middle East politics and this global war on terror. I mean, I did quite a bit of things on that. The Brown University did quite a bit of extensive research on that. What America did 20 years, they went after 12 countries. These are the poorest of the poor countries. So we're talking about, that's close to 700 million people we are talking about. They targeted these people and they spent $8 trillion, killed 900,000 people. That's the lowest estimate. I mean, what the hell is that? I mean,
well, well, a couple of several things there. So the first is that we know that this so-called war on terrorism is not a war on terrorism. That really has nothing to do with it. If we define terrorism as the use of violence against non-combatants for political purposes, then we know that the biggest terrorist in the world is the U.S. state itself, the Israeli state, and states more generally. So we know it's an utter farce to say that, total and complete farce, and anyone that can't see through it is, well, completely blind to simply legitimate what are the real U.S. objectives in this, in the Middle East and in elsewhere. And there's several. One is social control. That the events of 9/11, the background to those events is still never fully clarified, but the events of 9/11 were simply a pretext for the United States to militarize all of global society, to escalate its intervention worldwide, and really to bring us into a qualitatively new situation, politically, geopolitically, worldwide. But it allowed the ruling groups to incredibly enhance, not just in the United States. That's the thing. That's why it's important to talk about transnational capitalist class, because the U.S. state is representing the interests of global capital, right? So it allowed the ruling groups everywhere to radically escalate the repressive social control. So I think there's 150, 160 different countries passed so-called anti-terrorism laws. Here in the United States, it was called the Patriot Act. And these anti-terrorism laws allowed for an incredible clamped out, incredible radical escalation of repression against the popular and working classes, against dissidents, etc. So, part of this war against terrorism, in quotes, is really a war against all struggling peoples and dissidents around the world. Another thing which is not frequently taken into account is what I call in the second book, Global Civil War, I call militarized accumulation. In Global Police State, militarized accumulation. And here, obviously, military intervention and everything that goes along with it has geostrategic purposes. That we know, and that's what everyone discusses. That's what the mass media discusses, what academics, discuss, observers discuss. But there's another side to this types of intervention, and it's simply a way of making massive amount of profits through militarized, that's what I call militarized accumulation, through wars, through systems of mass social control and repression, from building border walls, from systems of mass incarceration to the expansion of police forces, et cetera, et cetera. All of this allows for tremendous profit making. And at a time when we have the overaccumulation crisis, and there are not other outlets for overaccumulated capital. So that's another key factor here. The third factor, which most people don't talk about with the Middle East wars waged by the United States, is further opening up the region to transnational corporate capital. And so, had big giant debates. They still continue to rage with these debates. In the aftermath of, the U.S. invades Iraq in 2003, and then occupies the country for many years. And at the time, all of our colleagues and observers in general were saying this was because the U.S. wanted to keep out China or Russia or Western European competitors. So, it's a U.S. imperialist competition with other imperial forces. And that really doesn't match up to the actual empirical evidence of what happened in the aftermath of that invasion. So, I remember so clearly the debates. The U.S. wants to grab oil so that Russia or France or China can't grab the oil in Iraq. But what happened? The U.S. invaded Iraq, set up the occupation force, and then Brenner, you might remember the name Brenner, you and I, younger people won't. He was the U.S. pro-consul, sort of the colonial governor during the occupation. And he issued a series of decrees known as the 100 Decrees, right, immediately, within days of, establishing his authority. And one of those first decrees was a declaration that Iraqi oil fields would now be open and available to investors from anywhere in the world under the canopy of the U.S. military occupation. And so the first two investors in the privatized Iraqi oil fields was the Chinese state oil company and Total. Total is the French state oil company. So what that shows, and by the way, both France and China diplomatically, came out against the war. Said the U.S. shouldn't invade. In the Security Council, didn't give the U.S. permission to invade. They were against the U.S. in the invasion. So what that shows is that the U.S. invasion had the purpose of opening up Iraq to global capital. right? Not exclusive zone for the United States. And so I think also the larger part of the story of what happens after 9/11, this massive escalation of U.S. intervention and warfare worldwide, is to further open up the whole world to the plunder of transnational capital. And these things need to be remembered. If we just focus on immediate geopolitical analysis, we miss the larger picture.
But also, like, I mean, I think you kind of mentioned about this, like, the problem with this economic crisis is like four-dimensional. And one of the dimension you mentioned about this ecological dimension.
Yes.
Like, so like when you have this, like this war on terror for 20 years, so it's not only like, just like bombing or thing, that's serious ecological destruction as well. So like, we are talking about, it's not millions, kind of close to billions people can actually now move from one place to another place.
Yes.
And then, you are talking about this like kind of apocalyptic kind of scenario, like, I mean, how to tackle that.
Yes. Well, to begin with, just linking the U.S. military intervention to the ecological crisis, as you've just done, we want to remember that that global capitalism is a war against nature, right? Now, it's a war against human beings, but we are part of nature also. So it's a complete war on nature. Part of the expansion in the new round of expansion of global capitalism is to appropriate more and more of nature, right, and to privatize more and more of nature. And the reason I consider that in the book Can Global Capitalism Endure, I say it cannot. It won't make it to the 22nd century. The big question is, can we overthrow global capitalism before global capitalism destroys civilization itself? But the reason I'm saying that, because, there's a long history on the Marxist left of predicting that capitalism is always entering the terminal crisis. Every time there's a crisis, a bunch of Marxists and radicals say, that's it, it's the end of capitalism. And we know that capitalism has proved to be incredibly resilient. The reason I'm saying no, this is in the longer picture of the whole 21st century, it is terminal, is specifically because of the ecological dimension, that the natural bases for the reproduction of global capitalism are being eroded to such an extent that the system will collapse in on itself ecologically, even if won't necessarily collapse in structurally or at other levels. But there's something else, and there's some dramatic data on that. I mentioned some of it in the book, but the ecologists have already provided us with all that information, that the sixth mass extinction is already underway. We know that if 70, 80, 90% of species alive doesn't make it to the 22nd century, we can't either, because our biological existence is so interlinked with the rest of the ecology. We can't exist outside of the rest of the ecology and the other species. If bees collapse, for instance, bees pollinate the vegetables, the plants that we need in order to survive, and that other plant-eating animals need to survive. And when the plant-eating animals can't get that plants because the bees have collapsed, the bee population, which is under extreme threat right now, then the carnivorous animals can't, and so forth and so on. We're faced with a collapse of agriculture worldwide. A collapse of agriculture means mass dying. And, you were pointing out with the question that, or with the comment to open this up, this ecological dimension of it, that also the collapse of whole ecosystems is leading to the collapse of the populations in those areas, and is triggering out mass migration, outward migration. So it's we have the social crisis of social reproduction, social disintegration, and social collapse all over the world. There's one study that I cite in the book, Can Global Capitalism Endure, that says by 2050 there will be 1 billion climate refugees. Right. And so 1 billion climate refugees means this unbelievable social crisis for, hundreds of millions of people are going to die in the coming decades. But it also means a crisis of social control for the system. How in the world can the system contain, 1 billion refugees who are not going to be passive? They're rising up, and they already are rising up. And so that means we're moving even more towards a global police state, towards a fortress, a global fortress, right, in which the rich and the privileged try and seal themselves off, and through a global police state, through digital and actual physical walls, and tightly can live comfortably inside. But that's not viable either. That's not viable. So yeah, it's because of this collapse, the threat of the collapse of the biosphere, that this is a terminal crisis for global capitalism. But I do need to stress that not That does not mean that capitalism will collapse in 5, 7, 12, 14 years, anything like that. What I mean is that it'll be a long disintegration if we don't overthrow it, and that it will not be able to survive through to the 22nd century and into the 22nd century. And again, just to recap, because of the ecological dimension, even if global capitalism could resolve the other contradictions.
Mm-hmm. I think you made a small, I think, passing comment that whether like technology can actually, make some kind of, leeway for this global elites and global, this like transnational capitalist class, whether, they can churn up things again with like some kind of new innovative technology and then, make it more profit making, more kind of that kind of mechanism. I mean, how hopeful you are on that, or do you think it's just end?
Sure. So that's a great segue, your question, to turn to another very important theme here, which is digitalization, the new digital technology. So they are coming online very rapidly. Their introduction works accelerated through COVID. I mean, and we're of course conducting this interview on Zoom, for instance. But this is what the World Economic Forum people call the fourth industrial revolution, what others have called the second information wave age. And here we're talking about artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, the collection and processing and analysis of massive amounts of data. Every single thing that takes place now is datafied throughout the whole global economy and society. Robotization, 3D printing, autonomously driven land, air, and sea vehicles, virtual and augmented reality, new forms of energy storage, of course, nano and biotechnology. And the nano and biotechnology is very important. I hope we'll come back to it later in the interview, because we're seeing the rise of a biopolitical security state, right? The Internet of Things, quantum and cloud computing, which is a qualitative leap in computational capacity. So we're moving towards a situation where every person in every community on Earth is connected through a common digital network. This is radically new terrain, radically new. And smartphones, I think the figure now is there's 8 billion smartphones in the world. And even if you're impoverished, you can still get a smartphone because of the nature of the pricing and its availability, right? So, and then there's all the platforms, et cetera. So here's the thing. So the ruling groups are already drawing on this technology for social control, for accumulation, and they are hoping that these new technologies will bring about a productive reactivation. Because right now we have stagnation, chronic stagnation for quite a while now, and then the only thing that's keeping the economy going is this debt-driven growth. The global debt level is approaching $300 trillion. Think about that. That's 300 trillion is 4 times the entire value of the global economy, right? Of the global GNP. And that includes state debt, which is unsustainable. States cannot continue to get more debt to pay their bills. It includes consumer debt that hundreds of millions, maybe billions of people are able to at least buy food because they go into deeper and deeper debt. But that's maxing out. And then there's, of course, corporate debt. And so there's this debt-driven growth has concealed the fact that there's productive stagnation. Secondly is the financial speculation. Everyone's speaking about that, and that's through the roof. I mean, it's phenomenal, the levels of financial speculation, and that disguises the fact that we have productive stagnation. But I'm mentioning all of this because the ruling groups are hoping that this new wave of technology will be introduced and it will reactivate the productive, right? A productive reactivation of the global economy. That remains to be seen. But of course, the problem here is that these new technologies under the current regime of global capitalism are only going to aggravate overaccumulation and overproduction under consumption, because the technology is going to replace more and more workers. Especially you have a situation with these new technologies where you have machine learning. So this is very important. Because the ruling groups say, no, we'll still have all the jobs. We'll even have better jobs because you'll be able to run the computers and run this new technology. But machine learning means that the machines themselves, the computers themselves, will learn how to run themselves, right? Complex communication, right, through these technologies, and the role of algorithms, in in the whole system, and pattern recognition. These are the radical dimensions of these new technologies, unlike earlier technologies where, like when the car was introduced, millions of people lost jobs when they made carriages and maintained horses and horseshoes and all of that. But then they were absorbed into the new industries, so the automobile and the other industries. But now, the technological bases are there for the replacement of human beings that are not absorbed elsewhere. So it will only aggravate the underlying structural contradictions, of the crisis. But yes, we really need to focus and understand this role of technology in global capitalism and in its crisis. And the other thing that's coming down the line now is digital identity, digital currency, right? And that's very significant. I didn't even touch on it in this new book, and I'm barely starting to think through it, as are other people. And that's linked to something else. So we haven't gotten yet into the geopolitical crisis, right? But that's also linked to the issue of dollar denomination of the global economy and what digital currencies or alternative currencies mean for the global geopolitical order, right? And the international system, which is another whole dimension of the crisis. Right?
Well, I think kind of mentioned briefly about the role of China, like the way China's rise and how this will affect, the future scenario. But at the same time, you're talking about the way the system is, this like world capitalist system. China is part of that. China is not outside of it. So
exactly, yes.
So can you give us some more kind of, because it's quite subtle area. I mean, I don't understand much about this. So if you, like for layman like me.
Yes, and this is another big area of debate that I've had with our colleagues, and with all due respect to my colleagues who constantly critique me, and that's good. It's good for me to be critiqued because I consider that I'm really on the cutting edge here of seeing what is the transformations involved here. But I think a lot of our colleagues are using 20th century theoretical perspectives that have become rigid and dogmatic because they cling to them, and they can't capture the empirical reality of the 21st century. So one aspect of that empirical reality is the transnational integration of capitals that were national. So most of our colleagues still speak about US capital, German capital, Chinese capital, Brazilian capital. And when you actually study the structure of global capital, and again, my critics don't look at the empirical evidence, they just use this language that left over from the 20th century. When you look at the empirical evidence, they're at the commanding heights, not the lower levels. The commanding heights, there's no such thing as US capital, or British capital, or German capital, because the level of transnational integration of these capitals is absolutely phenomenal. And my earlier books, not this trilogy that I mentioned, 2000, the last 3 books, but my earlier books over the last 25 years have massively documented this. So have other people that have been doing the similar research on the transnational capitalist class. We've shown this incredible transnational integration of capitals. So going back to the issue of China that you're asking about, China is kind of a special case when you're looking at the whole world for a number of reasons, not just because it's going to be the center of the world economy right now, the global economy. It's becoming a Sinocentric global economy, the gravity of the economy. But it's a complex thing to analyze for another reason, that there's 2 elites. They're obviously interconnected and overlap, but you have a capitalist class. They're investing all over the world. They've integrated with capitals elsewhere all over the world. And again, I've documented some of this. Chinese capitalists have more of an investment in Apple than do Warren Buffett and the 3 U.S. individuals, which are sometimes, Tim Cook. They're identified as the big investors in capital, but Chinese capitalists have a bigger investment in Apple than these U.S. capitalists. So, so the Chinese capitalist class is totally integrated, and they don't want it into dollar denomination because they hold so many treasury bonds, et cetera. But then you have a state party elite in China, and they're thinking in terms of the Chinese state and the power of the Chinese state and the prestige of the Chinese state, right? And other strategic issues. So it's a different kind of an elite with a strategic approach to the world. And so these 2 are in a tense relation. There are state party elites, which are also capitalists, and there's many capitalists, transnational capitalists, that are members of the Communist Party. But we still have to, at least methodologically and politically, we need to see that there's these two different elites. But so to go back to what you're raising, China is deeply integrated into global capitalism. We have a single globally integrated production, financial, and service system. Every country in the world is integrated. Maybe not North Korea, maybe one or two places remain outside. And China is totally and deeply integrated. And it cannot extricate itself, and neither do the Chinese capitalist class or the elite want to extricate China, right, from the globalized economy. So you're hearing a lot of discussion now that we're going to have different regional economies. That's not going to happen. Absolutely not. The level of integration is inextricable. You don't move backwards in that sense. But what we have is the contradiction between a globally integrated economy with a nation state based system of political authority and 200 sovereign nation states. And the state in each of these nation states has a contradictory mandate. The nation state, meaning the US state, the British state, the Chinese state, the Salvadoran state, wherever you look, they have to do two things, the states. First, the states have to attract transnationally mobile capital, and the states have to create conditions inside their national borders for the free accumulation of globalized capital. Right? So that means keeping workers' wages under control. It means free trade agreements. It means doing everything to attract global capital and to have capital accumulate in your territory. It brings jobs, it brings tax base, it brings wealth, right? Etc. But the other thing states have to do is achieve internal legitimacy and defend the legitimacy of the state and keep the internal social order stable. And that is a contradictory mandate. What you have to do to integrate and attract global capital is different than what you have to do to achieve internal stability and hold together the social order. And they enter into contradiction. So part of the tremendous escalation, very dangerous escalation of geopolitical conflict and confrontation around the world right now, of course, highlighted by two things: by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the radical political, military, economic response of the West to it, and the new Cold War between China and Washington and the United States. Those are, symbolizing the cutting edge symbolizing of this geopolitical tensions. Let us hope and pray we won't have a nuclear war, or World War III. That's the biggest danger right now. Bigger than the ecological crisis because it's more immediate, that danger. But what I'm getting at here, when going back to China, you're not going to have China trying to pull out of the global economy. You're not going to have the United States try to isolate China from the global economy. That's absurd. But you have this contradiction between geopolitical confrontation and economic integration. And I don't think, to conclude, that China is going to be the new hegemon. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the historical social sciences, we analyzed that there have been a succession of hegemons in the world capitalist system. The very first one was Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, right, from 1492, the conquest of the Americas and on. Then later on, Spain has its golden 16th century. Then you have the hegemonic center shifts to the Dutch, right? And that's the Dutch century, or less than a century. And then the hegemonic power shifts to the UK, to England, to United Kingdom. So you had those three before we get to the United States in the 20th century. So you had these four hegemonic powers shifting around. And so that's called in international relations, as you very well know, hegemonic transition theory or hegemonic stability theory. And the idea here, and I agree with it, I'm not disagreeing with it, is that a hegemonic power establishes the rules for the whole world capitalist system and stabilizes everyone around those rules. And so is an anchor. The hegemonic power is an anchor, right, which holds together the system. So a lot of people are saying now there's this struggle for decline of US hegemony, which there is, but we have to analyze it in a different way, not the regular way people are doing. And then the rise of a Chinese hegemon. But I don't think that's the case. I don't think there will be another nation state hegemon, because no single nation state can control global capital accumulation. No single nation state can stabilize the system. So we're in a period of economic integration with political multipolarity emerging. And it's not clear how we'll emerge from this, how the system will restabilize itself, what's going to happen in the rest of this decade, the 2030s, the 2040s. Again, let us hope we avoid a third world war. But I don't think we're simply going from Spanish to Dutch to British to U.S. hegemony, and now a new one is going to come along and stabilize the system. I think we're in a new ballgame now.
Mm. I mean, does it sound like very bleak future we are heading for?
Okay, so yes, but there's a big but here. So in my book, in the book, Can Global Capitalism Endure? Um, uh, Jason Moore, my colleague, he's a sociologist and one of the leading ecologists, Marxist ecologists worldwide, at least in the English language. And he did a wonderful guest prologue to the book. And when he read my first draft, I sent him the first draft. And then he wrote me back and said, William, just a caution, you don't want to fall into catastrophism, right? And he's absolutely right. For a number of reasons. Number one, because it's politically disarming. If you say that's it, we're going down, we're all going to be destroyed, then no one, right? Then it's politically disarming. But the other thing is that even that it is bleak in the sense of the seriousness of the crisis, but it is not bleak in terms of what we from below, the global working and popular classes, and those intellectuals among us like you and me, who are attached to or support those classes, are on the move, and there's this global revolt underway, and there's a political awakening, and there's a mobilization worldwide. As we speak, every minute you turn around, there's a new social explosion somewhere. Currently, it's Peru, but it's not just Peru. It's all over. It's Sri Lanka again. In France, you're in the UK, and there's a series of strikes, unprecedented in 3-4 decades. In France, there is two rounds of 1 million people taken to the streets in Paris against the pension reforms and other neoliberal measures. Wherever you look in the world, there's these mass social explosions from below. And so this is what makes it not so bleak. And the ruling groups know this. They know that they're on the defensive. There's such... we had this congresswoman, a right-wing Republican congresswoman. Today is we're doing this interview on a Friday, so this was earlier this week. I think it was Monday or Tuesday. Two things happened in the U.S. Congress. One is that the U.S. Congress passed a resolution condemning socialism. I mean, we have pure capitalism. Yeah. It said we are condemning any talk about the barbarism of socialism. Absolutely pathetic. But why did they do that? Because they're scared. They're scared. The socialist sentiment has never been higher in the United States. And as part of the discussion in the Congress, this congresswoman from Florida read out. I showed it to my students. She read out. She's reading from a speech, and she says, "We have a very serious situation. Generation Z, and of course that's the young generation, 40% more. So she said more." Bigger percentage of Generation Z considers Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto where they want to get their inspiration from, and rather than the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson in the United States. So you have this political awakening, you have this radicalization, especially of youth all over the world. They're rejecting, the polls show that there's this mass rejection of capitalism and a new embrace of socialism and of radical thinking. So this is not all bleak. What makes it, so worrisome, not bleak, but worrisome, is the threat of Third World War and the threat of ecological collapse. Yes, those two make this really scary moment. But there's a lot of room for optimism here, and there's a lot of inspiration on the mass struggles breaking out everywhere.
Thank you, William. Absolute pleasure. I mean, the things I plan to do, I mean, I think I covered almost everything. But also, you told this very personal story about, you spent time in Africa, in South America. So this is like powerful story. So it's not only you are an academic, but also you are an activist, pure activist. And I think, lots of people like me, I think you are my hero as well. So thank you so much.
I don't know about that. We're comrades in intellectual struggle. And of course, we link our intellectual work right to the mass struggles. Well, of course, it's always a privilege and an honor to be able to be interviewed and to speak about my ideas and know that they serve some purpose.
But also, you need to take care of yourself as well, William. You are doing too much. You're doing too much.
Well, my wife would totally agree with you.
Take it easy. You don't need to write like 3 books a year, you know. You did enough for the humanity already, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abdullah. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. You take care, comrade.
Okay, thanks so much. You too. Enjoy your holiday, okay?
Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay.
Bye.
All right.